All right, next up we have another lead developer here, Heather McCue, who's going to talk to us about expense validations. So,
exciting expense
stuff.
validations.
Using Evaluate. So take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk about using dynamic data-driven validations for expenses, and I'll explain why we're going to do that, how we're going to do it. You all know how the evaluation function works, I'm assuming. Is there anyone here who's not familiar with the evaluation function? Okay. So the evaluation part of it is like one line of a script. So we'll talk about that for about 30 seconds when I get to it, because before you can do the validation, you have to understand what is it you're validating and why and when. So there's a lot of structure around it. So we'll talk about that. Let's first, the backstory on this. The AP department at our client ISS in New York supports approximately 2,000 different program participants. Basically, they manage their budgets, they manage their money, and so each participant has their own budget, and everything that they pay for is funded by Medicaid and OPWDD in the state of New York, which is the Office for Persons with Developmental Disabilities. So if the government is paying for something, you can guarantee there will be rules and conditions that surround those payments. Things that are, for example, some anti-fraud measures. Two people can't be, double dipping and billing for the same time. They can't, submit expenses for the same thing on two different expense reports. Well, so the system that all of that goes into needs to be able to let the users know, let the AP clerks know when in fact there's a duplicate. If you can imagine a very busy department with, say, 12 people, each handling hundreds of expenses a day, that if two duplicate expenses are submitted and Sally enters the first one, but Joe enters the next one, they're not aware that they have entered duplicate expenses. So it's up to the system, which by the way is named Harmonics with an X. We didn't name it, the client named it. So Harmonics is responsible for catching those errors and duplicates before the checks get cut. All right? So we have 4 different groups of people that can be submitting expenses. The participant themselves, their support staff. These are people who work for them on their behalf through as part of the program. And what we call the circle of support. That would be their parents, their brokers, etc. And of course, third-party vendors. So we get direct bills from vendors, expenses for, say, rent or utilities or summer camp, horseback riding therapy, things like that. We get the bill directly, and when I say we, I mean ISS. We're that close. Anyway, so we're really partners with ISS, not legally, but in a relationship, right? So we get these expenses from a summer camp, and we bill it to the participant's budget, but it's coming from the vendor. We're going to pay the vendor directly, okay? We also have 4 different types of expenses, and so that means that we have 4 different layouts for each expense type, because if all you're entering is mileage, the only data that you have to key in for every line is the date and how many miles, right? You don't need much else. Brokerage, it has a time requirement. We pay by the hour. So on that form, they have to enter a start and stop time in addition to their date. And then, of course, reimbursement and vendor invoices are, pretty standard entry like you would expect for any expense: date, quantity, price, etc. So if you think about what you'd have to do to validate and make sure that things that shouldn't get through don't get through, here are some of the challenges that we face. Participants aren't allowed to overspend their budgets. If they have a budget for $1,000 for utilities, that's for 12 months. Well, who is keeping track of how much has been spent up to today. So if someone submits an invoice for an expense for $150, is there $150 left in the budget? Well, the AP clerk doesn't know that. And for every line that they enter, they certainly don't want to have to go ask someone or go look at the budget. Harmonic should just know it. You know, it's just magic, right? We also have different anti-fraud protections I mentioned earlier, things that are universal across the board, like we shouldn't allow them to submit expenses that have a future date because we can only reimburse for things that actually happened, except for when we do prepay for things. Like rent is always paid in advance of the period that it's covering. Your summer camps are paid in advance. And so there are some exceptions, but the general universal rule would be you can't pay for something that's in the future. And then, of course, we have different requirements, different rules at the expense level and the per line item level, right? One of the rules at the expense level is the payee that you're using isn't valid anymore. There's something wrong with that payee. That doesn't affect the line items, but it affects the expense itself. Is it going to go through? At the line, we're looking at things like dates, or is this a duplicate? Or does the end time on a brokerage, is that earlier than the start time, right? Things, basic, normal, logical things, as well as a number of, I won't say archaic, I'll just say complex rules. And then if you try to implement those rules in our kind of old school FileMaker thinking, we run into performance and sustainability issues. You know, we can use things like hide conditions, we can use conditional formats and tooltips, but remember, we have expense level violations, if you will. We have line level errors, and we have it for every line. And right now we're at about 36 different types of things that we are validating. Try to do that on 4 different layouts for the 4 different expense types. So here's an example of the UI feedback that we used to provide. So on the left, we've got a mileage expense. And again, like I said before, it's just date and miles, right? And of course, regardless of the expense type, they can always add a comment or a note to each individual line. So we have that there. And then on the right here, we have an example of a basic vendor invoice. And you can see that we're showing some violations here. We've got dates that are in the future. And then those, there are tooltips. I didn't capture those in my screenshot here, but there are tooltips attached to those warnings that are telling them about things like this is a potential duplicate. So let's talk about the duplicate for a moment. How do you know that that line is a duplicate? Any ideas?
You're doing some comparison, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I bet you're using the evaluate function.
Wouldn't that be nice, right? Okay, actually it wouldn't be nice to do that with UI feedback. This is incredibly costly. The schema behind this is scary, right? Because from that line item, we have to know, 37 different things. And we need the schema to support it if we're going to provide this feedback. But I'll tell you the worst part about this feedback, you can't guarantee that the AP clerks will do anything about it. They can ignore it. You're giving them the feedback, but you're not requiring that they conform with the rules. So
just to clarify, you're saying this is the bad way?
This is the bad way. I'm a big proponent of instant feedback. Like, don't show a button if the user isn't allowed to click it. That's amazing, the fact that we can hide things. I love it, I love it. In this, if we were looking at one that was brand new and had an empty line, they wouldn't be able to enter any of this data until there's a date in that row. They can't enter the price and quantity until they've selected which budget line that's going to get charged to. So even today, in the good way, we still do some of that. I'm never going to get rid of all of the UI tricks, right? Okay, but if we've got 30 plus different rules that we've got to employ here, we end up with layouts that look like this. Okay, we got tooltips, and I didn't even show you the calculations behind the tooltips. or the calculations and how many different conditional formats there are behind each of those individual objects. And again, multiply all those options times 4 different layouts, and the client says, hey, we need to not be able to do this anymore. Effective 2 weeks ago, according to the state of New York. We don't have any control over that. Our client doesn't have control over that, but we have to implement it. This is a pain, right? It was really cool at first. We can do all these cool things, when there were 5 things we were looking for, the obvious logical things like this is in the future. But then they started having problems with users ignoring what they knew. The throughput at ISS is phenomenal. They are very fast. I can't even follow I've stood over their shoulders and watched them, and I am amazed and impressed how quickly they're able to enter these things. It doesn't surprise me that some of these UI elements, they get used to seeing them and they start ignoring them. You have enough of them that turn out to be okay, like false positives on a potential duplicate. They'll just start ignoring them. Yeah, that's like using sticky notes for your passwords, right? It's in that genre of not good. So we had to find a better way. So we decided we're not going to rely on the AP clerks. Not that they're not bad people or anything. They're just human, right? And the number of rules and criteria that we had to, manage and not just enable them, but ensure that in fact they were being followed, kept growing. And there's no end in the future, right? And rules that we had in place yesterday might go away tomorrow in favor of some other rule. So we decided we're going to do a validation workflow here. Just real quick, basically, without looking at specific data here, the concept is you perform a validation test. Now that validation test might be of the expense or it might be at the line level. We perform a test, and if it fails, we produce an error. And we kick it back to the AP clerk to fix it. Now, if they aren't going to fix it, they might be able to override it. Again, you are going to have some things where you have false positives, like a potential duplicate. It might not actually be a duplicate because we can't test for absolute duplicates because we can't compare the documents that came with them. We don't have that level of granularity. What we can do is say, is there another expense on this date with the exact same budget line for this participant? That's a possible duplicate, but it might not be an actual duplicate, right? So we might give them the option to override, and that is an exception, in which case it's valid. If it didn't fail the validation in the first place, it's valid. And then if all the objects, meaning the expense and every single line, pass every validation test, then the expense gets transferred to bookkeeping so it can be paid. And the AP clerks never see it again, right? So that was the idea. So here's the structure behind it. We created a validation rules table where we can define the rules. This is where the evaluation comes in. And I'll show you that a little bit later in the presentation here. We'll actually define a calculation that if true, they pass. If not true, it fails and it returns an error. So for each expense and each line, we create a validation record. Now, you'll notice that those are 0 or 1 to many on the validations. The validations themselves are not per rule. We create one validation record for the expense and one validation record for each line item. Now, these are very narrow tables, the validations themselves. They basically know the core details like who it is, who's the participant, who's the payee, what's the budget line, what's the date, and what's the amount. That's all that's in there, more or less. We then compare it, we evaluate the test that was defined in the validation rule, and it either passes or doesn't based on that workflow. But one line item might have 20 different tests that have to be performed against it. So this process will do that for each rule that applies. And then if there are any errors, we actually produce an error record that's a permanent record. And the value of that is if the system found an error and they did not hold that expense, if they overwrote it, they want to know who did it, when, and why. Because the whole, I wasn't the one who did it. I didn't see that. That purple exclamation mark wasn't even there. Really? Yes, it was. We have a permanent record of it, and we'll have a record of who overwrote it or provided an exception if necessary. So the first piece, the validation rule, multiple type-specific validations. So the validation rules, we identify them as belonging to an expense or belonging to lines. One or more validation rules can exist for each expense and each line item, because if the expense fails validation, well, they're going to have to fix it, override it, or reject it. If they say they fixed it or they did an override, we don't just assume that they actually did the right thing. Like if they say, I fixed it, we don't know if they actually fixed it. So it gets resubmitted and it goes through the validation process again. And we don't reuse the validation record that we created this morning for these items, because that's a history of what we found and what the data was. We create another set of validation records and we revalidate from the ground up each time it's submitted. The value of that is sometimes you'll have a customer, and this could be any customer, it could be any individual, again, they're humans. When something went through that shouldn't have, and someone says, well, I tried it 5 times and it didn't work, and then suddenly it worked. Harmonics is broken, right? Well, we can look at those multiple validations and we can see, oh, but the payee the first time you tried it was 123, but the payee when it passed validation was 342. It wasn't the same criteria, and that's why it failed and then didn't. And I won't read all of this, but the gist of this I've already said. Basically, if there are no errors, it passes go and goes to bookkeeping to get paid. All right, so here are some validation rules. And I don't know if maybe when you edit this you can zoom in a little. But these are just the first 31. We're actually up to, I believe, 37 right now, but this is what would fit on my screen when I got the screen capture. If we look closely up at the top, the very first one is, it's an invalid batch. That's an expense level test. They've assigned this to a batch that is no longer available. That batch, that payables batch has already had its checks cut and been paid. So it's going to kick it back, and they're going to have to assign it to a new batch and resubmit it. Things like, hey, we didn't select a budget line, and et cetera, et cetera. We'll see more of this in just a second. All right, for each of those validation rules, again, we categorize them. Which expense type does it apply to? And to avoid any conflicts or confusion, for those of you who remember what I said earlier, I said there were 4 expense types, but brokerage and contractor are actually the same thing, but they changed the name about a year ago. They said, yeah, we don't want to call it contractor expense anymore because the only contractor expense is brokerage, right? We also define whether it's expense or line. Again, we can have multiple types that a rule applies to, but only expense or line item in terms of the rule. Here's an example of one of the calculations that we evaluate. So they can be as simple as there is no value in the budget line field, or it can be more complex. What I didn't include here is a picture of the graph that surrounds the validation. The nice thing, remember I said you got 37 different rules, and our graph for expenses and line items was ugly. This graph is very small because it contains, from the context of the validation record, only the things we need for the calculations that exist in the validation rules. We run a script. First, we load the rules. This is a one-time thing. We do this once per session. So every time an expense gets validated, we don't need to do this. We prepare for the validations by checking a few obvious things. We set some shared variables, like who was the staff, who was a participant, et cetera. And we populate which validations we're going to use. based on the what expense type was it, and am I looking at a line item or am I looking at an expense validation right now? Then we populate the validations for the lines. The first one was for expenses. Here we basically loop through and find the rules we need for this. One thing that we have to do is get budget lines. Won't spend any time on this, but the values that are returned by this step are used by the evaluations we'll do when we actually validate a rule. We loop through per validation record. We loop through all the different validation rules and do stuff. Okay. This line right there, line 183, is where the magic happens, where we actually run a subscript that literally says evaluate the rule that I'm looking at right now against this record. Do I pass or not? And if I get a result from that, I have an error. And at the end, if I have errors, and I've left out calcs and a lot of behind the scenes things on this in the interest of time, but if we have any errors at the end, we're going to change that expense status to an error. Otherwise, we're going to send it to bookkeeping for payment. And these are the results we get. So if an expense has errors, it's going to end up back in the AP clerk's queue for them to look at. They're going to look at it, and over there on the left, it's real small, but you'll see those little warning symbols next to some of those lines. There are tooltips attached to them that will tell them what the error was per line, or they can click on the errors option down here and it'll open up the error results. And they can see these are line level errors because we see dates, and it says it's a possible duplicate entry. It tells you which expense it might be a duplicate of. And in this case, we're looking at one where it's already been overridden. So we see that an override was accepted. We could click on that tool and change it. We can also look at tooltips to say who overrode it and when, etc. Here's another one where we have both line level expense errors at the top, where we see the dates, and then we have some expense level errors. And we see multiples of the same new payee not yet confirmed. And that tells us that this is on its third validation test. The first two times they said they fixed it, but we can see now that it came up again, so it hasn't been fixed. And it's not going to go to bookkeeping. Bookkeeping's not going to have to worry about it. They're not going to get stuff that failed. It's just not possible, right? I'm showing here the popover, if you click on the wrench, where they can say, I fixed this, or I'm rejecting it, etc. And down at the expense level, they'll have the option to actually reject the whole expense. If they think they fixed everything, they hit the release button at the top, and it automatically throws it back into the validation queue. All happens server side, and we're done.